First, a disclaimer. So I'm not a medical person. I'm what you call a bureaucrat. So I feel like I'm alone in this room. It's just to give you an overview of my role. So I'm a manager of regulatory practice and analysis at MedSafe. What that actually means is most of the rest of MedSafe is concerned with the approval of medicines, managing supply chain, doing compliance and enforcement under the Medicines Act. My unit started life as a psychoactive substances authority, a regulatory authority, and because of changes in legislation, the work of that authority never really took off because one of their main functions was to look at approving low-risk substances for use as psychoactive substances. So we then morphed into doing anything to do with the Misuse of Drugs Act, and then morphed again into a regulatory practice and analysis team. What that actually means is think of us as the bridge between government policy and big P policy and the regulatory implementation. So we try to make sure that whatever the policy people put in place, it's practical, able to be implemented and able to be enforced. So hence the medicinal cannabis scheme, when that became more than a glint in the government's eye, came down to our unit. The other part of my work is also to do with the therapeutics bill, which is currently out for consultation. So that will be is planned to be introduced later on this year, and then we'll kick into a whole sort of regulatory implementation where we go down to those next level of those regulations, rules and notices. And the other sort of parts that we're also involved in is regulation of vaping products under the Smoke-Free Environments Act. And we're also on the periphery at the moment of natural health products. As you know, the bill for that was introduced late last year, but it wasn't reinstated after its third reading when there was a new parliament. So our remit is quite broad, but our focus right now and our priority right now is to implement what the government wants of this medicinal cannabis scheme. So I am a career bureaucrat. I don't apologise for that, but my interest is making sure that regulation that is put in place is practical and enforceable and able to be implemented. Overview of the presentation, so the role of MedSafe, definitions, what the current prescribing requirements are, what the impact of the recent changes have been, and then just talk a wee bit about our thinking regarding the scheme. So as I said earlier, MedSafe in the Ministry of Health, we administer these legislation, Medicines Act, Psychoactive Substances Act, Misuse of Drugs Act. Natural health products mean that there are rules and regulations around you can't have controlled drugs and prescription medicines in foods. The exception is the recent changes to the hemp regulations which allow hemp seed foods which are allowed to have very low levels of contamination with cannabinoids. So just key definitions. We use the words consented and approved interchangeably, but what it means is that a medicine has been approved for distribution in New Zealand. It's been looked at by MedSafe, and it's had its quality, safety and efficacy data looked at and is approved for distribution in New Zealand. So when we talk about medicinal cannabis, we're talking about all forms of products derived from the cannabis plants, including CBD products that are used for medicinal purposes. What we're not talking about is what is touted in the media as synthetic cannabis. Now these are chemicals that are manufactured and then distributed illicitly, and what they do is they get this plant called Damiana and they dry that and then they spray the chemicals onto those plants. That is described in the media as synthetic cannabis. So we're not talking about a legal regime around those. So they are the ones where if you spray it, you might get inconsistencies on how you spray it. You'll get hot spots where there are a lot of concentration of it, and that's what is causing those deaths that we talked about last year in the media, those 45 deaths with names like 5-FADB and AMB Fubinaca and things like that. So they are synthetic cannabinoids, which are sometimes called synthetic cannabis, which are not part of the scheme. The next two slides are sort of taken straight from the legislation. I won't read it out because you can read this for yourself. It's on your handouts. But the CBD product is sort of meant to mean a cannabis product that is mainly CBD. And we have had to put some limits of it. So we put this 2% of other psychoactive substances limit in it. And when we talk about 2%, we're not saying that of the total product, 2% can be THC and other psychoactive substances. We're talking about the total cannabinoid content, 2%. So if your total CBD content, cannabinoid content is 50%, then it's 2% of that 50%. It's probably a wee bit more complex, but it doesn't mean 2% of the total 100. So when we say that it can't contain a specified substance, these are the definitions of a specified substance. So it's basically anything that's psychoactive, which means THC and any other of the products that have a psychoactive component. Or officially it says capable of inducing more than a minor psychoactive effect by any means in a person. So that's the official one. So you've got a handout there which is your summary of approvals required to prescribe cannabis products. This is on our website. So the requirement for ministerial approval, which has been delegated to the ministry, is because these cannabis preparations and THC are controlled drugs. So cannabis preparations and the tetrahydrocannabinols are class B1 controlled drugs, and the cannabis plant material is a class C1 controlled drugs. So all of the class A, B1, C, B2 and C1 controlled drugs require ministerial approval to supply and administer. So that is directly a requirement of the regulations. So that ministerial approval can apply to specific cases or a class of cases. And so when I talk about the current prescribing requirements, the Minister, in describing what's going ahead of the scheme, wants us to look at these prescribing requirements, and I'll talk a wee bit more about that in more detail. So each class of product has different prescribing requirements, and if you can, it's I suppose to me, in looking at it, it seems quite simple, but I suppose the flowchart looks a bit complicated. But essentially the green boxes, you don't need ministerial approval to prescribe. So that's CBD products and Sativex, where it's being used to treat multiple sclerosis symptoms. Everything else requires ministerial approval. So if you're using Sativex for off-label use, that requires an application for approval. Similarly, a pharmaceutical grade product which has not been consented for distribution, or a non-pharmaceutical grade product that is being applied for. So an application for approval is required. And if you go onto our website, you'll find a link to the forms that are required for that. So apart from Sativex, all products contain, including the CBD products, what we call non-consented. In other words, they haven't gone through the full approval process in providing clinical data, efficacy data, all of those things. So they are what we call non-consented products. They cannot be advertised, and they can only be prescribed by a medical professional, and you need informed consent to do that. So what with these non-consented products, we sometimes call them unapproved products, so it's another term for it, or what we call Section 29 products, but that's sort of like ministry jargon, I guess. So the Section 29 of the Medicines Act deals with supply and only allows supply of these non-consented products to medical practitioners. I just want to talk a wee bit about the legislative changes, because you would have seen in the media that the Misuse of Drugs Medicinal Cannabis Amendment Act came into effect in December 2018. So CBD was descheduled, is no longer a controlled drug, but is still a prescription medicine. Effectively, that didn't have any effect on what its status was, because the Expert Advisory Committee on Drugs recommended that it be descheduled several years ago, but the only way that you can downschedule a substance is through an amendment to the Act. So at that time, some changes were made to the regulations to remove some of those requirements that were put on it because it was a controlled drug, but effectively it remained a controlled drug without those restrictions. So the amendment to the Act basically removed CBD from the Misuse of Drugs Act, so it's no longer a controlled drug, but it remains a prescription medicine. The second part of the amendment is that people requiring palliation have a statutory defence for possession and use of a cannabis utensil. This amendment sort of started off as people with a terminal illness having a statutory defence, and then there was a big long discussion on how you would define that and what that meant. So it changed to people requiring palliation, which I think is a more wider term. It doesn't mean that the use of cannabis is legal. It just means that if you require palliation and you are using it, then you will not be prosecuted for it. Having said that, that is the way the police have been operating anyway. So they haven't been targeting users, especially in a situation where they might have had a terminal illness. Their priority is to actually target suppliers of this. So doing this sort of makes it quite clear to putting that in the legislation. The Amendment Act also allows regulations to be made to prescribe standards for cultivation, manufacture and for cannabis products. And I'll talk more about that because that is an important part of the scheme. The other part that is important to the scheme is it allows a licence holder to be able to use domestically sourced plants and seeds. What that means is because cannabis is illegal in New Zealand, there has to be a way of allowing domestic cultivars, because I understand that in the community, in the medical community, it might be a highly prized strains and all of that sort of thing. It would be silly to say, no, you can never ever use New Zealand strains of cannabis. The other part, which is sort of putting this big black cloud around my head, is requiring these regulations for quality standards to be made by 18th of December this year, which is 1 year after the Amendment Act came into force. So while the requirement is for the regulations for the quality standards to be made by that time, there is a general expectation that the scheme will be up and running by that time. In other words, we will be allowing cultivation, domestic cultivation and manufacture to proceed from that date onwards. So we're not putting our penny in down saying it will be ready by then, but because the regulations will be made by then, we should be ready, aiming to be ready pretty soon after that. So, medicinal cannabis scheme, what is it? So this current government had their 100-day plan to introduce the legislation and pass it, and that was the Amendment Act that was passed in December. They also committed to introducing a scheme that would make medicinal cannabis products more readily available. So then when you say, well, how are we going to do that? There are two parts to it. One is increasing the supply by allowing for domestic cultivation and manufacture, and also putting in place a scheme that will make it easier for these things to be produced, but with the whole accessible, more affordable products than is currently available. And the other part of it is increasing access to these products by reviewing the prescriber requirements and the information needs of prescribers, what we are calling removing the barriers to prescribing. So in doing so, we are in the process of setting up a medicinal cannabis advisory group that is going to oversee the implementation of this scheme and will advise us. So we are planning to put out a consultation document in May, June this year, which will set out the details of the scheme and what the regulatory proposals will be. As part of our international obligations, because it basically says that the International Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs basically says that a government agency can only allow cultivation of cannabis for medical purposes or scientific research, and if they do allow it commercially, then there has to be an agency that oversees that process, or pretty much it says the agency has to take control of the crop. And we can do that in a number of ways, and we've chosen to do it through the ability to license the players in the industry. So as I said, consultation on details of the scheme will be in May, June this year, but prior to that we'll be engaging with this advisory group and getting their views on those proposals before we go out for consultation. And then again, these have to be passed by December this year. So I think as part of that, the government's desire to make these things more available, last year the Minister signalled that he wanted to set up an advisory group to look at an interim advisory group to look at the prescribing requirements and prescriber information needs, because the big part of the scheme is what are the barriers for prescribers to prescribe them. And we'd sort of identified there are a number of things that might get in the way, and the first one was basically getting the assurance of that quality, which is why the government decided that they would require these products to meet a quality standard, and that is something that will again be assessed by MedSafe. So what we're doing is basically saying that with the scheme, there is the Medicines Act pathway for getting your products to full consent, and also there are those existing pathways that we have at the moment for unapproved products for prescriber for specific named patients only. But we will be looking at what those requirements for getting a ministerial approval are, and looking at how we can either streamline that or remove some of those requirements. And that will be part of that consultation. So I guess that's sort of really where we've got to in the development of the scheme. So why we've sort of said that there is a Medicines Act pathway, the Minister sort of wanted us to also look at whether there was an alternative pathway for getting these products to market. But the key thing here is, and I'm sure you will agree, is patient safety. And so we are developing these quality standards that will both look at the standards for manufacture as well as the standards of quality for the products themselves. And they will be some non-negotiable requirements For example, that there not be any microbiological contamination, no heavy metal and pesticide contamination, and there will be specifications about the performance of the products. So that is being developed by a technical group, and they will go out for consultation with the details of the scheme in May, June this year. This isn't about the referendum. I think it's worthwhile mentioning it as the sort of elephant in the room, if you like, about recreational use. So the referendum is separate from this, and one of the reasons why there is a need to get this legislation through by the end of this year is to keep it well clear of any debate on the referendum. So the referendum is about legalising recreational use. It's been run out of the Ministry of Justice, but because one of the key aims of looking at whether or not we should legalise it is to do harm minimisation from a health perspective. So we are very much involved in that. So what they're saying is that there is going to be a binding referendum to determine whether there should be legalisation of cannabis. And the government have said that if we do that, then the regulatory model will be about government-controlled regulated market. So there will be some crossover. So if we put a scheme in place to regulate cultivation, then that's likely to have some crossover into the recreational market. So what the government is intending to do is to put some regulatory proposals out there, because it's not going to be, the referendum is not going to be a simple yes or no question, should we legalise or not, because the public will want to know what exactly are they voting on. If you vote yes, what does it mean? If you vote no, what does it mean?